Billionaire Sehyun Park pressed his forehead against the cool window of first-class seat 1A. His tailored Tom Ford suit soaked with sweat as his 7-month-old daughter, Chae Mi-ok, unleashed another piercing scream that seemed to vibrate through the entire aircraft. For 2 hours and 43 minutes, Sehyun had been checking his Patek Philippe watch obsessively. Every passenger on the Trans-Pacific flight had endured the relentless crying that no amount of wealth, technology, or desperation could silence. Sehyun had tried everything his billions could buy. He'd attempted the Swedish rocking technique his $300 per hour nanny had demonstrated. He'd offered Mi-ok imported formula from Switzerland, changed her designer diaper 3 times, and even played specially engineered white noise from his $4,000 noise-canceling headphones pressed against her tiny ears. Nothing worked. The other first-class passengers were no longer bothering to hide their contempt. Flight attendants had exhausted their repertoire of suggestions, each failure making their professional smiles increasingly strained. Even the pilot had made a pointed announcement about ensuring all passengers enjoy a peaceful journey, and Sehyun knew exactly who that message was meant for. That's when something unthinkable happened. A teenage boy from the economy section appeared at the edge of the first-class cabin, his olive green t-shirt worn thin and dotted with visible holes, his backpack held together with duct tape and determination. Without asking permission or offering explanation, the boy stepped forward, his eyes locked on the screaming infant. "Sir," he said quietly, his young voice somehow cutting through Mi-ok's wails. "May I try?" Sehyun stared at this stranger, this child who had dared to cross the invisible barrier between classes. Every instinct told him to refuse. What could a teenager in threadbare clothes possibly know about caring for his daughter that trained professionals didn't? But exhaustion has a way of breaking down barriers that pride builds. Sehyun was so depleted, so desperate, that he found himself nodding before his rational mind could object. The moment Jake Macaulay's hands touched Mi-ok, the impossible happened. The screaming stopped. Complete, absolute silence fell over the entire airplane cabin as 200 passengers collectively held their breath, waiting to see if this miraculous quiet would shatter. The teenager was holding Mi-ok with a confidence that seemed impossible for someone his age, his fingers applying gentle pressure to specific points along her spine, while he hummed a soft, rhythmic melody that Sehyun had never heard before. Mi-ok's eyes, which had been squeezed shut in agony for nearly 3 hours, slowly opened and focused on Jake's face. Her tiny fists unclenched. For the first time since takeoff from Seoul, she looked calm, peaceful, almost content. "How did you?" Sehyun whispered, staring at this mysterious teenager who had accomplished what pediatric specialists and high-priced childcare experts couldn't achieve. Jake smiled gently, continuing his rhythmic patting. "My grandmother taught me. She raised 6 kids and about 20 grandkids in our neighborhood. Said babies don't need expensive things. They just need the right touch and the right frequency." Sehyun looked around the cabin and saw something that made his chest tighten. Every single passenger was staring at them, not with annoyance anymore, but with amazement and relief. Some were even smiling. But what shocked Sehyun most was what he noticed about this young man who had just performed what felt like a miracle. Jake's backpack was covered with mathematics and engineering competition patches. His notebook, visible through the open zipper, was filled with complex circuit diagrams and equations, and there was an intelligence in his eyes that seemed to burn with intensity far beyond his years. "Who are you?" Sehyun asked, his voice filled with wonder. The teenager looked Sehyun directly in the eyes with a maturity that was startling. "My name is Jake Macaulay. I'm 16 years old. I'm from the South Side, and I'm on my way to San Francisco to compete in the World Robotics Championship." Sehyun felt his world tilt slightly as he realized that the person who had just saved his sanity and his daughter's comfort wasn't some trained professional or fellow member of the elite. He was a brilliant teenager from one of America's most challenging neighborhoods, traveling on a ticket his community had pooled their money to purchase. But as Jake continued to hold Mi-ok, who was now cooing softly and reaching for Jake's face with curious fingers, Sehyun had no idea that this chance encounter was about to reveal a story of genius, sacrifice, and determination that would challenge everything he thought he knew about worth, potential, and privilege. and neither of them knew that what happened next would change both their lives in ways that money alone could never buy. Si-hyun Park was the 8-year-old founder and CEO of Nexus Core Technologies, a Seoul-based artificial intelligence company valued at $12 billion that was revolutionizing machine learning applications across Asia. He was traveling to San Francisco for the Global Innovation Summit, where he would announce a partnership that could expand his company's reach into Silicon Valley and beyond. Normally, Si-hyun traveled with an entourage assistants, translators, security personnel, who managed every detail of his journey. He worked during flights, conducted video conferences from 40,000 feet, and arrived at destinations refreshed and ready for high-stakes negotiations. But this trip was different because his wife, Yoona, was recovering from complications following emergency gallbladder surgery and couldn't care for their 7-month-old daughter, Mi-ok. "I can postpone the summit," Si-hyun had told Yoona as she lay in the hospital bed, still pale from the operation. "Absolutely not," Yoona replied firmly, despite her weakness. "This partnership is too important for the company's future. Take Mi-ok with you. You're her father. How difficult can it be to manage a baby for 5 days?" Si-hyun had hired the most prestigious childcare agency in Seoul to find a traveling nanny. The woman they sent had impeccable credentials, degrees in early childhood development, references from 3 prominent families, fluent in English and Korean. But she had tested positive for COVID-19 the night before the flight. With no time to find a replacement, and the summit schedule too critical to reschedule, Si-hyun found himself boarding a plane to San Francisco with a 7-month-old baby, minimal childcare experience, and a packed itinerary of presentations, meetings, and networking events that could determine his company's trajectory for the next decade. For the first 90 minutes of the flight, Mi-ok had been perfect. She slept peacefully in the first-class bassinet while Si-hyun reviewed his presentation slides and answered emails from his executive team. He began to think his wife had been right. How difficult could it be? Then Mi-ok woke up screaming, and Si-hyun's confidence evaporated like morning fog. He tried feeding her the bottle that Yoona had prepared with detailed instructions. Mi-ok rejected it violently, turning her head away and crying harder. He tried changing her diaper in the cramped airplane bathroom, a claustrophobic experience that left him sweating and flustered, but Mi-ok continued screaming. He tried walking the aisles, bouncing her gently the way he'd seen Yoona do countless times, but Mi-ok's cries only intensified, becoming more desperate and anguished. The flight attendants offered suggestions with professional courtesy that couldn't hide their growing concern about the disruption to other passengers. "Sometimes babies just need to cry themselves to sleep," one attendant suggested diplomatically. "Have you tried skin-to-skin contact?" another offered, though her eyes showed skepticism that this businessman would be willing to remove his suit jacket and shirt mid-flight. Nothing worked. Mi-ok screamed with an intensity that seemed impossible for such a small human being, her face turning red, tiny fists clenched, tears streaming down her cheeks. As the hours crawled by, Si-hyun became acutely aware of the hostile atmosphere developing around him in the first-class cabin. In seat 2B, Japanese businessman Takeshi Yamamoto was making increasingly loud sighs and typing aggressive emails on his laptop, his jaw clenched with barely contained irritation. "This is precisely why children shouldn't be permitted in first class," Yamamoto muttered to his colleague in Japanese, apparently assuming Si-hyun wouldn't understand. "If you cannot control your child, stay home." In seat 3A, American tech investor Patricia Blackwell was recording voice memos on her phone, probably complaining to colleagues about the inconsiderate parent who was ruining her flight. "Some people have no business traveling with infants," she said loudly to her assistant. "It's selfish and disruptive to everyone else who paid for a quiet, comfortable experience." Si-hyun felt heat rising in his face, a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and shame. These were people from his own world, wealthy and influential individuals who should understand that sometimes circumstances beyond your control create impossible situations. But their judgment felt particularly sharp because Si-hyun was failing at something he had always assumed would come naturally to any parent. He was a visionary CEO who had built a billion-dollar company from nothing, who managed teams of hundreds and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. Yet he couldn't figure out how to comfort his own 7-month-old daughter. The most painful part wasn't the other passengers' contempt, it was watching Miyokei's distress and feeling completely powerless to fix it. Every scream seemed to express not just physical discomfort, but a deeper need that Si-hyun didn't understand how to meet. For the first time in his adult life, he felt truly helpless. As the flight progressed, Si-hyun began to panic about more than just the immediate situation. He had 5 days of crucial presentations and negotiations in San Francisco. He couldn't bring a screaming baby into conference rooms filled with potential investors and partners. His entire American expansion strategy could collapse if he couldn't figure out how to care for Miyokei properly. What Si-hyun didn't know was that 4 rows behind him in economy class, 16-year-old Jake Macaulay had been listening to Miyokei's cries with growing concern and recognition. Jake was traveling to San Francisco alone, carrying a backpack containing his few possessions and a plane ticket purchased with money his community had raised through bake sales, church fundraisers, and small donations from neighbors who believed in his potential. The World Robotics Championship was his one chance to earn a full scholarship to Caltech, an opportunity that could change not just his life, but his entire family's future. Jake came from the South Side, where he lived with his mother, grandmother, and 2 younger siblings in a cramped apartment above a laundromat. His mother, Patricia, worked double shifts as a home health aide to support the family, while his grandmother, May, cared for the children and half the neighborhood's kids during the day. 3 years earlier, Jake's baby sister, Destiny, had been born with severe colic that kept her crying for hours every day and night. The family couldn't afford specialists or expensive treatments, so Jake had spent months researching infant distress, learning about acupressure techniques from his grandmother's traditional knowledge, and experimenting with different approaches to soothe his sister. Through trial and error, patience and determination, Jake had eventually discovered a combination of gentle pressure points, specific rhythmic patterns, and calming vibrations that could stop Destiny's crying within minutes. "That boy's got healing hands," his grandmother would say with pride. "Jake can calm any baby in the neighborhood." As Jake listened to Miyokei's screams echoing through the airplane cabin, he recognized the same type of distressed crying that Destiny had exhibited. He could hear the specific pitch and rhythm that indicated the baby was experiencing digestive discomfort combined with sensory overload. He knew he could help, but he also knew that a black teenager from the inner city approaching a wealthy Asian businessman in first class was likely to be viewed with suspicion, hostility, or outright rejection. Jake had experienced enough prejudice in his 16 years to understand that many people would see his worn clothes and dark skin as markers of danger rather than compassion, regardless of his intentions or abilities. Security might even remove him from the cabin before he could explain. But as Miyokei's cries reached a fever pitch, and Jake saw the exhausted desperation on the father's face, he made a decision that would change everything. He stood up, shouldered his duct-taped backpack, and walked toward the first-class cabin. Every passenger he passed turned to stare, some with curiosity, others with suspicion. A flight attendant moved to intercept him, but Jake kept walking, his eyes fixed on the businessman holding the screaming baby. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let fear stop him from doing what was right. And in that moment, Jake Macaulay had no idea that his simple act of compassion was about to unlock opportunities that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his own potential, and reveal that sometimes, the most valuable gifts come from the most unexpected places. Are you listening right now? Help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories about overcoming the odds deserve to be heard. Stories about kids like Jake who have brilliance but not the bank account to match it. Help me show her that these tales matter by hitting that subscribe button right now. And if you want to see what Jake does next with that crying baby, comment "Jake's got this" below so I know you're rooting for the underdog in this story. Jake Macaulay stood at the threshold between economy and first class, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The curtain that separated the two sections might as well have been a brick wall for all the invisible barriers it represented. Behind him, economy passengers craned their necks to watch, some curious, others shaking their heads as if predicting his imminent rejection. Ahead of him, the first-class cabin gleamed with leather seats, ambient lighting, and the kind of space that cost more per square foot than his family paid for rent in a month. The baby's screams cut through his hesitation like a knife. Jake had heard crying babies before. His neighborhood was full of them. But this particular cry had a specific quality that he recognized instantly: the high-pitched, desperate wail that meant the infant was experiencing both physical discomfort and complete sensory overload. It was the same sound Destiny used to make before he'd learned how to help her. A flight attendant appeared beside him, her smile professional but her eyes wary. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat." "I can help with the baby," Jake said quietly, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. Years of navigating spaces where he wasn't welcome had taught him how to make himself seem smaller, less intimidating, more harmless. The flight attendant's expression shifted to something between pity and dismissal. "That's very kind, but the father has everything under control." They both looked toward seat 1A, where the billionaire was clearly not in control of anything. Si-hyun Park's expensive suit was wrinkled and damp with sweat. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled from running his hands through it. The baby in his arms was arching her back, face red and tear-streaked, screaming with such intensity that several passengers had put in earplugs. "Please," Jake said, meeting the flight attendant's eyes. "Just let me try. If it doesn't work in 60 seconds, I'll go back to my seat and won't bother anyone again." Something in Jake's voice must have conveyed his sincerity, because the flight attendant hesitated, glanced at the increasingly hostile faces of the first-class passengers, then made a decision that probably violated several protocols. "1 minute," she said quietly. "That's all you get." Jake nodded and walked forward, aware that every eye in first class was tracking his movement. He could feel their judgment radiating like heat. A teenage boy in a shirt with holes and shoes held together with superglue, approaching one of the wealthiest men on the plane. He knew exactly what they were thinking because he'd seen those expressions his entire life. When Jake reached Si-hyun's seat, the businessman looked up with eyes that were red-rimmed and desperate. Up close, Jake could see the man was younger than he'd initially appeared, maybe late 30s, but exhaustion had aged him. "Sir," Jake said, raising his voice just enough to be heard over Mi-ok's screams. "May I try?" Si-hyun stared at him for a long moment. Jake could see the calculation happening behind those tired eyes, the risk assessment, the social awkwardness, the sheer desperation battling against every instinct that said not to hand your infant daughter to a stranger. Desperation won. Si-hyun nodded, and Jake carefully took Mi-ok into his arms. The baby was lighter than he expected, and her little body was rigid with distress. Her face was contorted in anguish, eyes squeezed shut, tiny fists clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Jake could feel the tension in every muscle, like she was a spring wound too tight. "It's okay, little one," Jake murmured, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic tone that he'd discovered worked better than any lullaby. "I got you. You're safe." He positioned Mi-ok against his chest at a specific angle, not quite upright, not quite horizontal, that his grandmother had taught him to reduce pressure on a baby's digestive system. Then he found the spot on her back, just below her left shoulder blade, where the vagus nerve ran close to the surface. Jake began to tap. Not random patting, but a specific rhythm. Tap, tap, pause, tap. Tap, tap, pause, tap. The rhythm matched a resting heartbeat, 60 beats per minute, the tempo that human beings instinctively found calming. His grandmother had explained it as matching the baby back to peace, syncing the tapping with what the infant's body remembered from the womb. At the same time, Jake started humming. Not a song exactly, but a low vibration in his chest that Mi-ok could feel more than hear. The frequency was around 60 hertzes, roughly the same as a cat's purr, which studies had shown promoted healing and reduced stress in mammals. For 10 seconds, nothing changed. Mi-ok continued screaming, and Jake felt the weight of 200 passengers' skepticism pressing down on him. Then he adjusted his fingers slightly, finding another pressure point near her spine, and increased the vibration in his humming just a fraction. Mi-ok's scream caught in her throat. Her eyes opened, beautiful dark eyes that were wet with tears, and she stared up at Jake's face with an expression of confused relief, as if she couldn't quite believe that the pain was subsiding. The crying stopped. Complete, impossible silence fell over the cabin like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire universe. Jake continued the rhythmic tapping, the humming, barely daring to breathe as Miyokei's rigid little body slowly relaxed against his chest. Her fists unclenched. Her face, which had been scrunched and red, slowly smoothed out. A tiny sigh escaped her lips, the kind of shuddering exhale that comes after crying, and then she yawned, a jaw-cracking baby yawn that was so unexpectedly adorable that someone in seat 3B actually gasped. Jake looked up and found Si-hyun staring at him like he'd just witnessed a magic trick. But it wasn't magic. It was just paying attention, Jake thought. It was just learning what worked because you didn't have money for anything else. How did you? Si-hyun whispered, but couldn't seem to finish the question. Miyokei made a soft cooing sound and reached up with one tiny hand, grabbing a fistful of Jake's worn t-shirt. Her eyelids were already drooping, the exhaustion of 3 hours of crying finally catching up to her now that the discomfort had eased. Jake kept tapping, kept humming, watching as the baby girl fell into what looked like the first peaceful sleep she'd had since the plane took off. Around him, he could feel the atmosphere in the cabin transforming. The hostile stares had shifted to expressions of wonder, disbelief, and something that looked almost like respect. In seat 2B, Takeshi Yamamoto had put down his laptop and was simply staring. Patricia Blackwell had stopped her voice memo mid-sentence. Even the flight attendant who'd tried to send Jake back to economy was watching with her hand pressed to her mouth. Jake carefully transferred Miyokei back to Si-hyun's arms, showing him the exact position, the rhythm of the tapping, the low humming frequency. Keep this pattern going for at least 5 minutes after she falls asleep, Jake instructed quietly. Otherwise, she might startle awake. And if she starts crying again, it probably means she needs to burp or her diaper needs changing. But the crying itself has become a feedback loop that's making everything worse. Si-hyun took his daughter back with trembling hands, mimicking Jake's movements with careful precision. Miyokei stirred slightly but didn't wake, and Si-hyun's eyes filled with something that looked like tears. "Thank you," he managed to say. I don't know how to thank you." Jake shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention now that the immediate crisis was over. "It's no problem, sir. I should get back to my seat." But as Jake turned to leave, Si-hyun's hand shot out and grasped his wrist. "Wait," the billionaire said. "Please, what's your name?" Jake hesitated at Si-hyun's touch, instinctively pulling back slightly before forcing himself to relax. In his neighborhood, when someone grabbed your wrist, it usually meant trouble. But Si-hyun's grip was gentle, almost pleading, and his eyes held none of the hostility Jake had learned to recognize. "Jake Macaulay," he said quietly. "My name is Jake Macaulay. Si-hyun Park." The billionaire shifted Miyokei carefully in his arms, maintaining the rhythm Jake had shown him. The baby remained blissfully asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful breaths. "Please, sit for a moment. I have so many questions." Jake glanced back toward economy, where the flight attendant was watching with an expression that suggested she wasn't sure whether to intervene or not. Other first-class passengers were staring openly now, their expensive drinks and tablets forgotten as they witnessed this unlikely interaction. "I should really get back to my seat, sir. I don't want to cause any more disruption." "You haven't caused disruption, you've ended it." Si-hyun gestured to the empty seat beside him, the one that should have held the nanny who'd tested positive for COVID. "Please, 5 minutes. Let me at least buy you a drink, a meal, something to thank you properly." Jake shifted his backpack, acutely aware of how the duct tape holding it together looked in this pristine environment. But there was something genuine in Si-hyun's request, a kind of desperate gratitude that transcended the obvious class differences between them. "Okay," Jake said, sliding into the seat. 5 minutes. The leather was softer than anything Jake had ever sat on. The seat had more legroom than his bedroom back home had floor space. He tried not to gawk at the personal entertainment screen, the adjustable ambient lighting, the small amenities kit that probably cost more than his family's weekly grocery budget. Si-hyun was studying him with an intensity that made Jake uncomfortable. "How old are you, Jake?" 16, sir. "And you learned this technique for calming babies. Where exactly? From your parents?" "From my grandmother, mostly." Jake adjusted his backpack at his feet, and as he did, the zipper that had been partially open slid further, revealing the contents inside. "My baby sister had a really bad colic when she was born. We couldn't afford specialists or anything fancy, so I just figured out what worked. Sihyun's eyes had dropped to Jake's backpack, and his expression shifted from curious gratitude to something sharper, more focused. Jake followed his gaze and realized what the billionaire was seeing: the notebook. His most precious possession, the spiral-bound journal where Jake had been sketching designs and working through equations for the past 8 months, was clearly visible through the open zipper. The page it was open to showed a detailed schematic for a biometric sensor array, complete with circuit diagrams, mathematical formulas for signal processing, and annotations in Jake's cramped handwriting. "Is that?" Sihyun leaned forward slightly, careful not to jostle me. "Okay. May I?" Jake felt a flush of embarrassment mixed with defensiveness. His designs probably looked amateurish to someone like Sihyun Park, a tech billionaire who had access to the best engineers in the world. But he pulled the notebook out anyway, handing it over with hands that trembled slightly. Sihyun balanced Me-OK in one arm while he flipped through the pages with his free hand, and Jake watched the billionaire's expression transform from polite interest to genuine shock. The notebook was filled with months of work, schematics for servo motors that could replicate human joint movement, algorithms for machine learning that could recognize and respond to emotional cues, designs for a robotic hand that could adjust its grip pressure based on tactile feedback, page after page of complex engineering that Jake had taught himself using library computers, YouTube videos, and discarded electronics he'd salvaged from dumpsters behind tech companies. "This is..." Sihyun looked up, his eyes wide. "This is graduate-level robotics engineering. Where did you study? MIT? Stanford?" Jake felt his face grow hot. "I'm in high school, sir." "Well, I was. I graduated early last year. I taught myself most of this stuff online." "You taught yourself?" Sihyun repeated the words like he couldn't quite believe them. He turned to another page, this one showing the design for what Jake called an empathy engine, a processor that could analyze micro-expressions, voice patterns, and physiological signals to determine emotional states and respond appropriately. "This is extraordinary. Some of these concepts are similar to what my own engineers have been working on for years, but your approach it's more intuitive, more human." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just think about how people actually work, you know? Like with babies, you can't just program responses to crying. You have to understand that crying is communication, and sometimes the message isn't what you think it is. Same with robots. They need to be able to read the room, adjust to what people actually need instead of just executing commands." Sihyun was staring at him now with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. "Where are you going, Jake? What are you doing on this flight?" "San Francisco. There's a competition, the World Robotics Championship. It's at the convention center downtown." Jake heard the pride creeping into his voice and tried to tamp it down. "I qualified in the regional rounds. If I place in the top 3, I get a full scholarship to Caltech. All expenses paid for 4 years. And you're traveling alone?" "Yes, sir." "How did you afford the ticket? The entry fees?" This was the part Jake always found hardest to talk about, the part that made him feel simultaneously grateful and guilty. "My church raised money. Bake sales, car washes, a GoFundMe that some of the teachers at my old school shared around. My grandmother sold her wedding ring." His voice cracked slightly on that last part. "People in my neighborhood don't have much, but they all chipped in what they could. Said I was representing all of them." The weight of that responsibility sat heavy in Jake's chest. 247 people had contributed to his travel fund. He had a list of every name, every amount, tucked in his wallet. Mrs. Chen from the corner store had given him $20. The Martinez family had donated $50, even though their father had just lost his job. Mr. Johnson, who lived in a studio apartment on disability, had contributed $10 and told Jake, "You go show those rich kids what real genius looks like." Sihyun was quiet for a long moment, still looking at the notebook, but Jake could see his mind working behind his eyes. Me-OK stirred slightly, and Sihyun automatically adjusted his tapping rhythm, maintaining the pattern Jake had taught him without conscious thought. "This scholarship," Sihyun said finally. "What happens if you don't win? Do you have a backup plan?" Jake felt his stomach tighten. This was the question that kept him awake at night, the fear that lived underneath every moment of confidence. Then I go home and get a job, maybe community college if I can save enough. My mom needs help with rent, and my grandmother's getting older. They need me. But you want to study engineering. Wanting something doesn't mean you get it, sir. Jake tried to keep the bitterness out of his voice. In my neighborhood, you learn that early. Si-hyun closed the notebook carefully and handed it back to Jake, but his eyes never left Jake's face. The competition, when does it start? Day after tomorrow. Preliminaries are in the morning. Semi-finals that afternoon if I advance. Finals are the next day. And where are you staying in San Francisco? Jake felt heat creeping up his neck again. There's a hostel near the Mission District. $22 a night. I've got enough for 3 nights plus food if I'm careful. The look on Si-hyun's face shifted to something Jake couldn't quite identify. It wasn't pity exactly, but it was close enough to make Jake's defenses rise. He'd gotten this far without charity. His community had invested in him, yes, but that was different. That was people believing in his potential, not feeling sorry for his circumstances. Jake, Si-hyun said slowly, still maintaining that rhythmic tapping on Miyokei's back. I have a proposition for you. Jake's instinct was to say no before he even heard what Si-hyun was about to offer. Propositions from wealthy people always came with strings attached. He'd learned that from watching what happened to other kids in his neighborhood who'd accepted help that turned into obligations they couldn't escape. I don't need charity, sir, Jake said, his voice harder than he intended. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm good. Si-hyun shook his head, a slight smile crossing his exhausted face. This isn't charity, Jake. This is business. I have a serious problem, and you've just demonstrated that you have the solution. He gestured down at Miyokei, who remained peacefully asleep against his chest. I'm in San Francisco for 5 days with crucial meetings, presentations, and networking events that will determine my company's future in the American market. I was supposed to have professional childcare, but as you can see, that fell through catastrophically. Jake listened, his defenses still up, but his curiosity piqued. I cannot bring a screaming infant into boardrooms filled with potential investors, Si-hyun continued, but I also can't leave my daughter alone or with strangers I haven't vetted. What I need is someone who understands both her needs and has the skill to meet them. He met Jake's eyes directly. I'd like to hire you as Miyokei's caretaker for the duration of my trip. $1,000 per day. 5 days. That's $5,000. The number hit Jake like a physical blow. $5,000. That was more than his mother made in 2 months of double shifts. That was enough to pay back everyone who'd contributed to his travel fund and still have money left over for his family. You can't be serious, Jake breathed. I'm completely serious. You've proven you can do what trained professionals couldn't. You clearly have the intelligence and maturity to handle the responsibility. And frankly, Miyokei seems to trust you, which is more than I can say for anyone else who's tried to help today. Si-hyun shifted slightly, adjusting the baby's position. The competition you mentioned, when are your events scheduled? Preliminaries start at 9 in the morning, the day after tomorrow. If I advance, the semi-finals are at 3 that same day. Finals would be the following morning. Then we'll work around your schedule. You'll care for Miyokei when I have meetings, which are primarily during business hours. When you need to be at the competition, I'll manage. It's not ideal, but I'm learning. Si-hyun's expression softened slightly. And truthfully, having you there will give me peace of mind when I do have to be in negotiations. At least I'll know she's with someone who understands her. Jake's mind was racing, calculating possibilities. With $5,000, he could help his family for months. He could buy his grandmother a new ring, not her original one, but something nice. He could contribute to his siblings' school supplies, but there was also the competition to consider. Could he split his focus between caring for a baby and competing against the best young robotics engineers in the world? What about accommodations? Jake asked, still not quite believing this was real. You said something about where I'm staying. You mentioned a hostel for $22 a night. Si-hyun's expression suggested what he thought of that arrangement. That won't work. I'm staying at the Fairmont, the presidential suite. It has 3 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and more space than any reasonable person needs. You'll stay there. Separate bedroom, obviously, with privacy and room to work on your projects. The hotel has business facilities you can use, high-speed internet, printers, whatever you need to prepare for your competition. Jake felt dizzy. The Fairmont. He'd looked it up when researching San Francisco, seen pictures of the lobby with its massive columns and crystal chandeliers. Regular rooms there cost more per night than his family paid in monthly rent. The presidential suite was probably thousands of dollars a night. "This is insane," Jake said, but he could hear his resolve weakening. "Sir, I can't just—" "Can't what? Accept a job offer? Take payment for skilled work you're uniquely qualified to perform?" Si-hyun raised an eyebrow. "Jake, you demonstrated expertise that saved my sanity and my daughter's well-being. In my world, expertise has value. Significant value. If anything, I'm getting the better end of this deal." Jake looked down at his backpack, at the duct tape and worn fabric that marked him so clearly as someone who didn't belong in this world of leather seats and $1,000 payments. But when he looked back up at Si-hyun, he didn't see condescension in the man's eyes. He saw genuine need mixed with what looked like respect. "I have one condition," Jake said slowly. "I need to be able to focus on the competition when it's time. That's why I'm here. That's what 247 people invested in. I can't let them down." "Agreed. Your competition takes absolute priority. We'll arrange everything else around your schedule." Si-hyun extended his free hand, the one not supporting me, okay. "Do we have a deal?" Jake stared at the outstretched hand for a long moment. This was the kind of opportunity that didn't happen to kids from his neighborhood. The kind of moment that could change trajectories, open doors that were usually locked tight, but it also felt surreal, like at any moment someone would shake him awake and he'd be back in his economy seat, the whole conversation just a fantasy. He reached out and shook Si-hyun's hand. The billionaire's grip was firm, professional, the handshake of someone sealing a real business arrangement. "Deal," Jake said, and tried to ignore the way his voice trembled slightly. Around them, the first-class cabin had mostly returned to normal activity, but Jake caught several passengers still watching their interaction, with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disapproval. He could almost read their thoughts. What's that teenager doing up here? Why is someone like him shaking hands with Si-hyun Park? He doesn't belong. Jake had seen those looks his entire life. At science fairs where he competed against kids from private schools with their custom-built equipment while he presented projects made from salvaged parts. At the regional robotics qualifiers where other teams had matching jerseys and professional coaches while Jake wore his best thrift store clothes and coached himself. In stores where security guards followed him, assuming his worn clothes meant criminal intent rather than economic reality. But sitting in that first-class seat, with a job offer that would change his family's circumstances and access to resources he'd only dreamed about, Jake made a decision. Those looks didn't matter. Their judgments didn't define his worth. He'd proven his value not through expensive clothes or family connections, but through knowledge, skill, and the willingness to help when no one else could. "When we land," Si-hyun said, breaking through Jake's thoughts, "we'll go directly to the hotel and get you settled. I'll have my assistant arrange a credit card for any expenses you might need. Food, transportation, to the competition, anything for me, okay? Consider it part of your compensation package." "A credit card?" Jake's voice cracked slightly. He'd never had a credit card. His family dealt strictly in cash, food stamps, and the occasional money order. "For business expenses," Si-hyun clarified with a slight smile. "You'll need to be able to move freely around the city and care for me okay without worrying about having enough cash on hand. Don't worry, I'm not going to check if you bought yourself a decent meal or a new shirt." Jake glanced down at his worn t-shirt with its visible holes and felt a mix of shame and defiance. This shirt had history. He'd been wearing it when he'd won his first engineering competition. His grandmother had patched it twice. It was comfortable, familiar, part of who he was. But he also recognized an olive branch when he saw one. "Thank you, sir," Jake said quietly. "For all of this. You won't regret it." "I don't think I will." Si-hyun looked down at me, okay. who was still sleeping peacefully. Her tiny hand clutched in a fist against his chest. "You gave me my daughter back, Jake. You gave me hope that maybe I could actually do this father thing, even when I'm terrified and don't know what I'm doing. That's worth far more than $5,000. The passengers in first class judged Jake by his clothes before he even spoke. They saw the holes in his shirt, the duct tape on his backpack, and made assumptions about his worth as a human being. But Jake proved that character counts more than bank accounts, that skill matters more than status. If you believe we should judge people by their abilities and not their zip code, hit that subscribe button right now. Comment character counts if you're not siding with the snobs who thought Jake didn't belong in first class. Because this is just the beginning of Jake's journey. And you're going to want to see what happens when he gets access to the resources that match his genius. The Fairmont's lobby was more intimidating than any robotics competition Jake had ever faced. Marble columns stretched up to ceilings painted with gold leaf. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars cast prismatic light across floors, so polished Jake could see his reflection, worn sneakers, frayed jeans, backpack held together with hope and duct tape. He looked like someone who'd wandered in from the street, which wasn't far from the truth. Si-hyun strode through the space like he owned it, Myoke sleeping peacefully in a carrier against his chest, while Jake followed a few steps behind, acutely aware of the doorman's lingering gaze and the concierge's barely concealed surprise when Si-hyun gestured for Jake to join him at the private elevator that led to the penthouse suites. "Mr. Park, welcome back," the concierge said smoothly, though his eyes kept flickering to Jake with poorly disguised curiosity. "Shall I have someone bring up the young man's luggage? This is Jake Macaulay, my daughter's caretaker for the week," Si-hyun said, his tone brooking no questions. "He'll be staying in the suite with me. Please add him to the approved guest list and provide him with his own key card." The concierge's professional mask slipped for just a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. "Of course, Mr. Park. Right away." The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, except for the soft mechanical hum and Myoke's gentle breathing. Jake caught sight of himself in the mirrored walls, a skinny black kid in clothes that had seen better days, standing next to a billionaire tech CEO in a suit that probably cost more than Jake's entire wardrobe combined. The contrast was almost comical. When the elevator doors opened directly into the presidential suite, Jake forgot to breathe. The space was larger than his entire apartment building's first floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of San Francisco, the Bay Bridge, stretching across glittering water, the city's hills rolling away into the distance, boats leaving white trails across the blue expanse. The living room alone could have fit 3 of Jake's bedrooms. Cream-colored furniture that looked too pristine to actually sit on was arranged around a marble fireplace. Modern art that Jake suspected was original and probably worth more than his mother would make in a lifetime hung on walls painted in subtle, expensive shades. Jake couldn't find words. "This is unreal. It's excessive," Si-hyun said with a slight smile. "But it's home for the week. Your room is through here." He led Jake down a hallway past a kitchen that looked like something from a cooking show, past a dining room with a table that could seat 12, to a bedroom that was easily twice the size of the one Jake shared with his brother back home. The bed was massive, piled with pillows that probably cost $50 each. There was a desk by the window with a view of the bay, an ensuite bathroom with a shower that had more jets and settings than Jake's robotics project had circuit boards. "I can't stay here," Jake said, the words tumbling out. "Sir, this is too much. You can just accept it," Si-hyun interrupted gently. "Jake, you're providing a valuable service. You deserve comfortable accommodations. Besides," he added with a tired smile, "if Myoke starts crying in the middle of the night, I need you close enough to hear her. This is practical, not charity." Jake set his backpack down on the bed, the most expensive surface his salvaged electronics and duct tape notebook had ever touched, and tried to process the surreal turn his life had taken in the past few hours. Si-hyun showed him how to use the room's amenities, the climate control system that probably cost more than Jake's family paid in utilities for a year, the minibar that Si-hyun told him to help himself to, the phone system that connected to the concierge for anything he might need, Then Si-hyun excused himself to put Mi-ok down for a proper nap in the nursery setup he'd had the hotel arrange. Left alone, Jake stood in the center of his temporary bedroom and felt the weight of displacement settle over him. This wasn't his world. These weren't his people. No matter how nice Si-hyun was, Jake was still fundamentally an outsider, a guest who would return to his real life in less than a week. But then he thought about the competition, about his robot, still unfinished, still needing hours of coding and mechanical refinement, about the opportunity that was now within reach, not just because of the scholarship, but because he had access to resources he'd never dreamed possible. Jake unpacked his backpack on the living room's coffee table, a surface of glass and chrome that probably cost more than his entire robotic setup. He laid out his tools: a salvaged soldering iron, wire cutters with electrical tape wrapped around the handles, a multimeter he'd bought used for $15, screwdrivers in various sizes collected from garage sales. Next came the components: servo motors he'd pulled from broken toys, a microcontroller he'd bought with birthday money, sensors he'd carefully desoldered from discarded electronics he'd found behind tech companies in his neighborhood. The centerpiece was his robot, not much to look at really. About 18 inches tall, its frame built from aluminum he'd cut and bent himself, its circuits exposed and color-coded with wires Jake had meticulously organized. It didn't look like the sleek, expensive robots he'd seen in competition videos. It looked like what it was: genius built from garbage, potential constructed from poverty, but it was brilliant in ways those expensive robots weren't, because Jake had designed it with something their creators had never needed to consider: empathy. Si-hyun emerged from the nursery, Mi-ok presumably sleeping peacefully, and stopped short when he saw Jake's setup spreading across the living room. "Is this your competition entry?" Si-hyun asked, moving closer with the careful interest of someone who actually understood what he was looking at. "Yes, sir. I call it Care Compassionate Adaptive Response Engine." Jake's voice gained confidence as he shifted into the territory he knew best. Most robotics competition entries focus on speed, precision, task completion. But I figured, what if we built robots that could actually read human emotional states and respond appropriately? Not just follow commands, but understand context and need. Si-hyun knelt down to examine the robot more closely, and Jake felt a spike of anxiety. Up close, the salvaged components and jury-rigged solutions were even more obvious. The billionaire was probably used to seeing prototypes built in proper labs with unlimited budgets and professional-grade materials. "Walk me through it," Si-hyun said, and Jake heard genuine curiosity in his voice, not judgment. The San Francisco Convention Center's main hall had been transformed into a technological gladiatorial arena. Dozens of competition stations lined the massive space, each one a 6-by-6-foot square marked with white tape on the industrial carpet. Teams clustered around their designated areas, unpacking equipment from sleek cases with corporate logos, setting up laptops that still had price tags in the 4-figure range, arranging robots that gleamed with the polish of professional fabrication. Jake stood at Station 47 with his duct-taped backpack and his robot wrapped in a towel to protect it during transport, feeling like he'd accidentally wandered into the wrong building. The team to his right was from the Exeter Academy, 5 students wearing matching navy polos embroidered with their school crest. Their robot, a masterpiece of chrome and carbon fiber that probably cost more than Jake's family's annual income. To his left, the Stanford pre-college engineering program had set up what looked like a mobile lab, complete with backup components, diagnostic equipment, and a faculty advisor who kept offering suggestions, in a voice that suggested he'd helped design half the robot himself. Jake carefully unwrapped Care and set it on the competition table, and he immediately felt the shift in atmosphere around him. One of the Exeter students, a tall kid with perfectly styled blonde hair and a watch that probably cost more than Jake's travel budget, nudged his teammate and gestured toward Jake's robot with barely concealed amusement. "Is that thing held together with solder and prayers?" the kid said, not bothering to lower his voice. His name tag read Braden Ashworth III. His teammate, a girl with designer glasses and an expression of practiced superiority, laughed. "I think some of those components came from a trash heap. Look at that exposed wiring. Did he even try to make it look professional?" Jake's face burned, but he kept his hands steady as he connected CARE's power supply and ran his pre-competition diagnostic check. The robot's LED indicators blinked to life green across the board. Functional. Ready. "Hey, buddy," Braden called over, and Jake's stomach clenched. He knew that tone. It was the same one used by kids at school who thought poverty was a punchline. "You know this is an international competition, right? Not a middle school science fair. Might want to check if you're in the right building." Several teams nearby turned to watch, some with curiosity, others with the kind of casual cruelty that came from never having to worry about where their next meal was coming from. Jake took a breath and remembered his grandmother's words. "They can judge your clothes, baby, but they can't judge your mind unless you give them permission." He turned to face Braden with a calm he didn't entirely feel. "I'm in the right place," Jake said quietly. "Station 47. Jake McCauley, Southside Robotics. I qualified the same as you." "Southside Robotics?" The girl with designer glasses scrolled through something on her tablet. "I don't see that program listed. What school is that affiliated with?" "It's not affiliated with a school. It's me. I'm the programmer." That got more attention. Several nearby teams stopped their setup to listen. Jake saw expressions ranging from impressed to skeptical to openly mocking. "So you're telling me?" Braden said, walking closer and examining CARE with exaggerated interest. "That you built this creation in your garage or something? Without a team? Without proper facilities?" He leaned in, pointing at a section where Jake had used copper wire he'd salvaged from an old TV. "Is that literally stripped cable from hardware store scrap?" "It's recycled copper," Jake said, keeping his voice level. "Works the same as new copper, costs 90% less, better for the environment. The conductivity is identical if you clean it properly." "Right, but it looks like trash." Braden straightened up, addressing his comment to the growing audience. "I mean, presentation matters. If you show up to a competition like this with equipment that looks like you pulled it from a dumpster, what does that say about your professionalism?" "It says I had to pull it from a dumpster because I don't have rich parents," Jake thought but didn't say. Instead, he focused on connecting CARE's sensor array and loading the final version of his code. The Stanford advisor wandered over, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Son, did you pass the safety inspection? Some of these exposed connections could be flagged as hazardous." "I passed," Jake said, pulling out his approval form. "The inspector checked everything yesterday. It's all within regulations." The advisor studied CARE with an expression that managed to be both condescending and pitying. "Well, it's admirable that you made it this far. Really shows initiative. But you should know that the competition at this level is quite advanced. Don't feel discouraged if you don't make it past preliminaries. Just participating is an achievement." Jake felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd heard variations of this his entire life. "Good effort. Admirable try. Just participating is enough." Code words that meant, "We don't expect you to actually win because people like you don't win things like this." A competition official called for attention, announcing that preliminaries would begin in 15 minutes. Teams should complete their setup and prepare for the first challenge, navigating an obstacle course while identifying and sorting objects by color and shape, then delivering them to designated locations. Speed mattered, but accuracy mattered more. Jake watched the other teams do their final preparations. The Exeter robot moved with fluid precision during its test run. The Stanford team's entry had sensors that probably cost more than Jake's entire build. A team from Tokyo had a robot with AI processing power that Jake could only dream about. He looked down at CARE, his scavenged, soldered together, duct-taped manifestation of everything he'd learned and everything he hoped to become, and felt doubt creep in despite his best efforts to push it away. What was he thinking? These kids had resources, teams, facilities, coaching, funding. They'd been preparing for months, maybe years, with every advantage money could buy. Jake had been preparing in a crowded apartment between taking care of his siblings and helping his mother with bills, building his robot from components other people threw away. But then he thought about Miyokei's face when she'd finally stopped crying, that expression of relief and trust. He thought about his grandmother selling her wedding ring because she believed in him. He thought about Mrs. Chen's $20, Mr. Johnson's $10, the Martinez family's $50. 247 people who had invested not just money, but faith. Jake powered up Care fully and watched the startup sequence initialize. The robot's optical sensors activated, scanning its environment. The empathy engine, his innovation, his unique contribution to robotics, began its baseline calibration, reading ambient sound levels, temperature, movement patterns. Ladies and gentlemen, a voice boomed over the convention center's sound system. Welcome to the World Robotics Championship. Competitors, please take your positions. Preliminaries begin in 5 minutes. Jake's hands were shaking slightly as he made final adjustments to Care's programming. Around him, elite teams from elite schools with elite equipment were ready to prove what money and privilege could build. But Jake had something they didn't. He had necessity. He had hunger. He had 247 people counting on him, and a lifetime of being underestimated that had taught him to work twice as hard to get half as far. Braden caught his eye and smirked. Good luck out there, garage boy. Try not to embarrass yourself too badly. Jake didn't respond. He couldn't trust his voice not to shake. Instead, he looked down at Care and made a silent promise. They're going to learn that genius doesn't come from bank accounts. The official raised a hand. Competitors ready? On my mark. 3, 2, 1, begin. The rich kids are laughing at Jake's equipment because it's not brand new and shiny. They're judging him by his recycled components and exposed wiring instead of the brilliant engineering underneath. If you hate bullies who punch down, who mock people for having less, smash that like button right now. Comment, talent over money to show you stand with Jake, because what happens next is going to prove that innovation doesn't come from privilege, it comes from perseverance. And if you want to see Jake shut down these entitled snobs, you better subscribe so you don't miss what happens when Care hits that competition floor. Jake's preliminary round had been solid, not spectacular, but solid. Care had navigated the obstacle course with respectable speed, sorted the objects with near-perfect accuracy, and delivered them to the correct locations. He'd placed 18th out of 63 teams, which meant he'd advanced to the semifinals but hadn't made enough of an impression to silence the doubters. Braden's team had placed 3rd. The Stanford group had taken 5th, and Jake had watched them celebrate their advancement with the easy confidence of people who'd never questioned whether they belonged in the room. Now, back at the Fairmont with hours to kill before semifinals, Jake sat on the plush carpet of the presidential suite's living room with Mio-K, trying to identify what was wrong with his code while the baby girl played happily in her portable playpen beside him. The problem gnawed at him. Care's movements were technically correct but somehow mechanical, lacking the natural flow he'd envisioned. The robot completed tasks efficiently but moved with a stiffness that made it seem less adaptive, less responsive to its environment. The empathy engine was reading emotional cues correctly, but the physical responses felt disconnected, artificial. Jake had spread his laptop, notebook, and Care's exposed circuitry across the coffee table, running simulation after simulation. But he couldn't figure out what was missing. Mio-K babbled happily, reaching for a stuffed toy that Si-hyun had bought her, a plush robot that cost more than Jake's entire build budget. She grabbed it, squeezed it, then dropped it, and looked at Jake with an expression of pure expectation. "You want me to get it?" Jake asked, reaching over to retrieve the toy. "You literally just dropped it, little one." Mio-K's face lit up when he handed it back, and she immediately squeezed it again, her tiny fingers applying pressure in a rhythmic pattern. Squeeze, squeeze, pause, squeeze. Squeeze, squeeze, pause, squeeze. The same pattern she'd been doing with her toys all morning. Jake froze, toy halfway extended, his mind suddenly racing. The rhythm. It was the same rhythm he'd used on the plane to calm her. The tap, tap, pause, tap pattern that matched a resting heartbeat, that synced with the body's natural cadence. Mio-K wasn't just playing, she was self-soothing, replicating the pattern that had brought her comfort. Babies learn through rhythm, his grandmother had told him once. Everything from heartbeats to breathing to walking follows natural cycles. You can't fight the body's rhythm, baby. You have to work with it. Jake set the toy down and pulled his laptop closer, opening Care's movement code. He'd been programming the robot's actions as discrete commands move forward. Stop, turn, grab object, release each action, separated by decision trees and conditional statements. The robot was essentially waiting for permission at each step, processing whether conditions were met before executing the next movement. But that wasn't how living things moved. Humans didn't walk by consciously thinking, lift left foot, move forward, place left foot down, shift weight, lift right foot. Movement flowed, one action bleeding into the next in a continuous rhythm that the body maintained automatically. What if he programmed care the same way? Jake started typing, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Instead of discrete movement commands, he began writing code that established rhythmic patterns, base cycles that the robot would maintain unless external input required adjustment. The servo motors would operate on oscillating patterns rather than stop-start commands. The sensors would continuously feed data into the empathy engine, which would then modulate the bass rhythm rather than interrupt it. Myoke squeezed her toy again. Squeeze, squeeze, pause, squeeze. Jake translated that rhythm into code, testing different frequencies, until he found one that matched the pattern of human movement he'd been missing. He loaded the new code into Care and watched the robot initialize. At first, nothing seemed different, but then he commanded Care to navigate across the room, and the change was immediately visible. Instead of the jerky, start-stop motion from before, the robot moved with a flowing quality that looked almost organic. Its joints articulated smoothly, each movement anticipating the next, creating a continuous rhythm of motion. Holy shit, Jake breathed, then immediately glanced at Myoke. Sorry, little one, don't repeat that. Myoke gurgled happily, unconcerned with Jake's language. He ran Care through a series of test maneuvers. Pick up an object, the robot's arm moved with fluid precision, adjusting grip pressure smoothly rather than in stages. Navigate around obstacles, Care anticipated turns and adjusted its trajectory with a natural-looking flow that made the movement seem intentional rather than algorithmic. The difference was subtle but significant. Care no longer looked like a machine following instructions. It looked like it was thinking, adapting, responding to its environment with something that almost resembled intuition. Jake grabbed his phone and texted Si-hyun, who was in back-to-back meetings at a nearby tech campus. Major breakthrough on the code. Care is moving completely differently now. This changes everything for the semifinals. The response came within seconds. That's incredible. Myoke, okay? Jake glanced over at the playpen where Myoke was contentedly chewing on her toy robot's ear, drool running down her chin, completely at peace. She's perfect. She actually helped me figure it out. My daughter is a robotics consultant now. I should put her on payroll. Jake smiled and set his phone down, returning his attention to Care. He spent the next hour refining the rhythmic patterns, creating different bass cycles for different tasks. Heavy lifting required a slower, more powerful rhythm. Delicate manipulation needed faster, lighter oscillations. Navigation fell somewhere in between, with the ability to smoothly transition between speeds based on environmental feedback. The more Jake worked, the more he realized how profound this change was. He'd been so focused on making Care smart, on building sophisticated sensors and complex decision algorithms that he'd forgotten to make it natural. But nature operated on rhythm. Heartbeats, breathing, circadian cycles, the movement of animals, the growth of plants, everything in the natural world followed patterns that repeated and adapted. Si-hyun returned around 4 in the afternoon, looking exhausted but energized in the way that successful meetings produced. He found Jake still on the living room floor, now with Myoke sleeping peacefully on a blanket beside him, one tiny hand resting on Jake's laptop like she was part of the engineering team. Show me, Si-hyun said, loosening his tie and sitting cross-legged on the carpet with an informality that seemed at odds with his $10,000 suit. Jake demonstrated Care's new movement patterns, and he watched Si-hyun's expression shift from polite interest to genuine fascination. The difference is remarkable, Si-hyun said quietly, watching Care navigate between objects with its new flowing motion. It looks less like a machine and more like, I don't know, like it has intention. Purpose. It's rhythm-based movement, Jake explained, pulling up his code to show Si-hyun the structural changes. Instead of discrete commands, I'm using oscillating patterns that the empathy engine modulates based on environmental input. It's how humans move. We maintain base rhythms and adjust them rather than starting and stopping constantly. Si-hyun studied the code with an intensity that reminded Jake the man hadn't built a $12 billion AI company by accident. This is innovative, Jake. I've seen similar concepts in robotics research papers, but nothing quite like this implementation. Where did you get the idea? Jake looked down at Mioke, still sleeping peacefully, her chest rising and falling in its own natural rhythm. Your daughter taught me. The way she was squeezing her toy, it was the same pattern I used to calm her on the plane. Made me realize I'd been programming care all wrong. I was treating movement like a series of decisions when it should have been treated like a continuous flow that decisions modify. The convention center's preparation area buzzed with controlled chaos as teams made final adjustments before semifinals. Jake had arrived early, carrying care in its protective towel wrap with the careful attention of someone transporting something infinitely precious. Si-hyun had offered to have a car service drive him, but Jake had insisted on taking the bus. He needed the time to mentally prepare, to run through his strategy one more time. He'd set up at Station 47 again, unwrapped care, and connected the power supply for a final diagnostic check before the round began. Everything had been perfect when he'd left the hotel. The new rhythm-based movement code was flawless. Care had been operating at peak performance. But when Jake powered up the robot for his pre-competition test, something was immediately, horrifyingly wrong. Care's startup sequence initiated normally, LED indicators blinking green, sensors calibrating, empathy engine loading. But when Jake commanded a simple forward movement, the robot lurched violently to the left, its servos grinding with a sound that made Jake's stomach drop. He immediately cut the power and opened Care's chassis with hands that had started to shake. What he found made his blood run cold. Someone had tampered with the servo connections. The wiring that Jake had color-coded and meticulously organized had been deliberately switched. Red wires connected to blue ports, ground wires crossed with signal wires, creating a configuration that would cause the servos to receive contradictory commands. It was subtle enough that a casual inspection wouldn't catch it, but catastrophic enough to completely destroy Care's performance. Jake's hands trembled as he traced the damaged connections. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't a manufacturing defect or a loose wire from transport. Someone had opened Care's chassis and systematically rewired the servo array to sabotage his competition. No, Jake whispered, frantically checking the rest of the systems. The empathy engine's connections had been loosened but not disconnected entirely, just enough to cause intermittent failures. One of the optical sensors had been rotated slightly, throwing off its calibration. Even the power management circuit showed signs of tampering. Problem with your robot, garage boy? Jake's head snapped up to find Braden standing at the edge of his station, holding a coffee cup from the convention center's overpriced cafe, his expression a careful mask of false sympathy. Someone sabotaged my robot, Jake said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Someone opened my chassis and rewired my servos. Braden's eyebrows rose in exaggerated surprise. That's a serious accusation. You sure you didn't just wire it wrong in the first place? I mean, with all those recycled components and jury-rigged connections, it would be easy to make mistakes. Jake stood up, and despite being several inches shorter than Braden, he felt a fury that made him seem larger. I know my robot. Every connection, every wire, every solder point. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. Can you prove it? Braden took a sip of his coffee, his eyes cold behind the casual expression. Because, from where I'm standing, it looks like your scrap heap robot is falling apart under competition pressure. Maybe this level of competition is just beyond your capabilities. Other teams were starting to notice the confrontation. The Stanford advisor wandered over, followed by a competition official wearing a lanyard that identified her as a technical judge. What seems to be the problem? The official asked, her tone professionally neutral. Someone sabotaged my robot, Jake said again, gesturing to Care's exposed internals. Between last night and this morning, someone opened my chassis and deliberately rewired my servo connections to cause malfunctions. The official examined Care, her expression skeptical. Do you have any proof that this was sabotage and not equipment failure or user error? I photographed my complete setup last night for documentation, Jake said, pulling out his phone with hands that were still shaking. You can see the correct wiring configuration. And look, you can see fingerprints on the chassis screws where someone opened it. The official studied the photos, compared them to the current state, and her expression shifted to something more serious. This does appear to be tampering. However, without evidence of who did it or when, I can't take disciplinary action against any specific team. The best I can do is allow you additional time to repair your robot before your semifinals slot. How much time? Jake asked, already calculating whether it was even possible. You're scheduled for the semifinals in 40 minutes. I can give you 30 minutes to effect repairs, but after that you either compete or forfeit. 30 minutes. Jake looked down at Care's tangled internals and felt despair wash over him. He'd spent hours carefully routing those wires, testing each connection, documenting the optimal configuration. To redo it all in 30 minutes, to recalibrate the sensors, to test and verify everything was functioning correctly, it was impossible. I need to make a phone call, Jake said quietly. He walked away from the station, away from Braden's smirk and the growing crowd of curious onlookers, and found a quiet corner near the emergency exit. His hands were shaking so badly he almost couldn't dial Si-hyun's number. The billionaire answered on the second ring. Jake? Aren't you supposed to be competing soon? Someone sabotaged Care. Jake's voice cracked, and he hated himself for it. They rewired everything. I have 30 minutes to fix it, but it's not enough time. I can't. I don't think I can do this. Silence on the other end of the line, but Jake could hear Mio-K babbling happily in the background, completely unaware that Jake's entire future was falling apart. Where are you? Si-hyun asked, his voice calm but intense. Convention Center. Section B, near my station. Stay there. I'm 15 minutes away. Don't touch the robot until I arrive. Si-hyun, there's nothing you can do. Jake. The billionaire's voice cut through his despair like a knife. I didn't hire you because you know how to quit when things get hard. I hired you because you're the kid who figured out how to calm a screaming baby when experts failed. You're the kid who built a competition-level robot from garbage because you refused to let poverty stop you from being brilliant. Don't you dare quit now. The line went dead, and Jake stood there in the hallway, phone still pressed to his ear, feeling tears threaten at the corners of his eyes. He'd been so close. So impossibly close to proving that kids from his neighborhood could compete with kids from prep schools and privilege. And someone had taken that away with simple, cruel sabotage. He thought about his grandmother's wedding ring, sold and gone forever. He thought about Mrs. Chen's $20, Mr. Johnson's $10, the Martinez family's $50. 247 people who'd invested their faith and their money in him. He thought about going home and telling them he'd failed. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because someone had cheated and he'd given up. Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and walked back to Station 47. He had 30 minutes. Maybe he couldn't fix everything, but he could try. His grandmother hadn't raised a quitter. By the time Si-hyun arrived 17 minutes later, slightly out of breath, with Mio-K in a carrier and a determined expression on his face, Jake had already rewired half the servo connections. Show me what needs to be done, Si-hyun said, setting down a leather bag and pulling out what looked like a professional toolkit. I spent 3 years building circuit boards before I started my company. My hands might remember. Together, they worked with focused intensity. Si-hyun rewired while Jake recalibrated sensors. Jake tested connections while Si-hyun documented the correct configuration. Mio-K watched from her carrier, occasionally reaching out to touch Jake's arm as if offering encouragement. With 3 minutes remaining, Jake powered up Care and ran a diagnostic. Green lights across the board. He commanded a test movement, and the robot flowed forward with its characteristic rhythmic motion, servos operating smoothly, sensors reading accurately. Ladies and gentlemen, semi-finalist teams to your stations. Competition begins in 2 minutes. Jake looked at Si-hyun, at this billionaire who'd gotten on the floor in his expensive suit to help rewire a robot made from trash, and felt something shift in his chest. Thank you, Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. I was ready to give up. Resilience isn't about never falling down, Jake. It's about getting back up when someone pushes you. Sihyun gripped Jake's shoulder. Now go show them that cheating only works if you let it. The rival team cheated because they knew they couldn't beat Jake fairly. They saw his brilliance, recognized that his recycled parts robot was about to embarrass their million-dollar builds, and they sabotaged him like cowards. If you can't stand cheaters and manipulators who can't handle real competition, subscribe right now. Comment play fair if you want to see Jake get justice, because what happens in these semifinals is about to prove that talent always beats treachery. Don't miss it. The semifinals challenge was brutally simple in concept but devastatingly complex in execution. Each robot had to navigate a simulated disaster zone, a course filled with debris, unstable surfaces, and unexpected obstacles while locating and safely retrieving 3 survivors, represented by weighted dolls of varying sizes. Speed mattered, but the primary scoring criteria was how gently and safely the robots handled the rescue targets. Drop a victim, damage it, or handle it roughly, and points would be deducted. It was a test of precision, adaptation, and yes, empathy. Jake watched the first few teams compete with growing dread. The Exeter Academy robot was fast and efficient, completing the course in 4 minutes and 12 seconds with only 1 dropped object. The Stanford team's entry was slower but meticulous, using advanced sensors to map the entire course before attempting retrieval. A team from Singapore had programmed their robot to prioritize the smallest, most fragile objects. First, a strategic choice that earned appreciative nods from the judges. Then it was Jake's turn. He positioned Care at the starting line, his hands steady now, despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system from the sabotage and frantic repair. The semifinals challenge was more complex than preliminaries. Navigate a cluttered environment, identify objects that represented people in distress, weighted dolls with sensors that measured handling force, and transport them to safety zones without causing damage. Speed mattered, but the primary scoring metric was how gently and appropriately the robot handled the victims. It was a test of precision, decision-making, and ironically, empathy. Jake initialized Care's systems and watched the empathy engine begin its environmental scan. The robot's sensors swept the competition arena, cataloging obstacles, identifying the target objects, and calculating optimal routes. But unlike the other robots that would simply execute the most efficient path, Care was also reading ambient conditions, sound levels, movement patterns of nearby humans, even the stress markers in Jake's own biometric signature that the robot could detect through proximity sensors. The starting buzzer sounded. Care moved forward with its characteristic flowing rhythm, and Jake heard an appreciative murmur from the judges' table. The robot navigated the obstacle course with a grace that made the other entries look mechanical by comparison, each movement bleeding naturally into the next. When Care reached the first task station, identifying and sorting objects by emotional context rather than just physical properties, the empathy engine proved its worth. The challenge was designed to test adaptive AI. Objects were scattered across a platform: a baby bottle, a smartphone, a medical alert device, a book, a pill organizer. The robots had to identify which objects belonged to which demographic group: infant, teenager, elderly person, professional, and sort them accordingly. Most robots would rely purely on image recognition and pre-programmed categories, but Care did something different. Jake had programmed the empathy engine to consider context, not just classification. The robot's sensors read the environment, spotting a small child's toy near one corner of the test area, medical alert bracelet imagery in another section, a business card holder in a third zone. Care didn't just sort objects by visual matching. It understood context and delivered items to locations that made sense for the people who would use them. The judges noticed. Jake could see them leaning forward, making notes, exchanging glances. But halfway through the semi-finals challenge, disaster struck again. Care was navigating the obstacle course flawlessly, its rhythm-based movement creating fluid transitions between tasks. Then, as it approached the final sorting station, one of the optical sensors, the one that had been tampered with earlier, suddenly failed. The connection that had been loosened during the sabotage finally gave out completely. Care stopped mid-motion, its empathy engine unable to process visual input from the dead sensor. The robot stood frozen while Jake watched his semifinals run fall apart in real time. The judges were watching. The other teams were watching. Braden was watching with barely concealed satisfaction. Jake had 15 seconds to make a decision before Care would be automatically disqualified for failing to complete the course within the time limit. His mind raced through options. He could try to restart the robot, hope the sensor reconnected, but he knew from the diagnostic error code flashing on Care's status LED that the sensor had completely failed, probably a delayed consequence of the earlier sabotage, a connection that had been loosened just enough to fail under the stress of competition. He couldn't fix it. Not in the middle of a timed round. Not without the right tools and replacement parts. But he could improvise. Jake's eyes fell on the bag Si-hyun had left at his station, the leather bag containing the billionaire's personal items. Inside, Jake knew, were Si-hyun's noise-canceling headphones, the expensive ones he'd mentioned using to try to calm Mi-ok on the plane. Headphones that probably cost $1,500 and contained sophisticated audio processors and environmental sensors. "Excuse me," Jake called out to the technical judge monitoring his station. "Am I allowed to modify my robot during the competition?" The judge consulted her tablet. Modifications are permitted between rounds as long as they don't violate safety regulations. You have 5 minutes before your semi-final run begins. 5 minutes. Jake grabbed Si-hyun's leather bag left behind when the billionaire had rushed back to his meeting and found the noise-canceling headphones inside. They were Bang & Olufsen, top of the line, probably $1,500 of audio engineering perfection. Jake didn't hesitate. He pulled out his wire cutters and cracked open the headphone casing. Inside were beautiful, sophisticated components, multiple microphones for active noise cancellation, a powerful digital signal processor, accelerometers for detecting head movement, and most importantly, an array of environmental sensors that monitored ambient sound and adjusted the cancellation frequencies in real time. Jake's mind raced. The semi-finals challenge had just been announced. Design and demonstrate a robot that could assist with a real-world task that improved quality of life. Teams had 15 minutes to modify their existing robots, then 5 minutes to present and demonstrate their innovation to the judges. Most teams would focus on industrial applications or medical assistance, safe, predictable demonstrations of technical capability. But Jake had something none of them had: intimate, recent experience with a problem that millions of parents faced every day. He pulled out his soldering iron and began to work. The modification was audacious, possibly insane, but Jake's mind was racing with possibilities. He carefully extracted the active noise-canceling circuitry from Si-hyun's headphones, $4,000 Bang & Olufsen headphones that the billionaire had handed over without hesitation when Jake explained what he needed. The noise-canceling technology used inverse sound waves to create silence. But what if, instead of canceling sound, Jake could modify the circuitry to generate specific frequencies? His fingers flew as he rewired Care's audio output system, integrating the headphone's noise-canceling processor into the empathy engine. He recorded the sound generation algorithms on the fly, pulling from his memory of the frequencies that had calmed Mi-ok on the plane, 60 hertzes, vibrations, rhythmic patterns that matched resting heartbeats, tonal qualities that human nervous systems instinctively found soothing. The semi-finals challenge had been announced. Design a robot that could assist with a real-world caregiving scenario. Teams would be judged on innovation, practical application, and the sophistication of their robots' adaptive responses. It was almost like the competition had been designed specifically for what Jake had learned over the past 3 days. When Jake's turn came, he wheeled Care to the demonstration area, with Si-hyun watching from the audience, Mi-ok sleeping peacefully in her carrier. The judges, 3 robotics professors, 2 industry professionals, and a representative from Caltech's engineering department, sat behind a long table with tablets and scoring rubrics. Jake had watched the previous competitors. The Exeter team had demonstrated a robot that could sort recycling with impressive speed. The Stanford group had shown a robot that could navigate disaster zones and identify survivors. Both were technically impressive, well-funded, and exactly what everyone expected from a robotics competition. But neither of them had what Care had. Competitor 47, the head judge announced. Jake McCauley, Southside Robotics. You may begin your presentation. Jake wheeled Care to the demonstration area, and he heard the familiar murmurs from the crowd. The duct-taped backpack kid. The garage-built robot. The underdog who'd barely squeaked through preliminaries and had almost been disqualified in semifinals due to equipment issues that Jake hadn't been able to prove were sabotage. But the semifinals had gone better than Jake could have hoped. The new rhythm-based movement code had made Care stand out, and he'd placed 7th high enough to advance to finals, high enough to catch the judges' attention. Now, for the finals, competitors had been given a new challenge. Demonstrate a practical, real-world application of their robotics technology. Most teams would showcase industrial applications, search and rescue scenarios, or medical assistance protocols. Safe, predictable, impressive, but conventional. Jake had something different planned. Competitor 47, the announcer called. Jake McCauley, Southside Robotics. Jake wheeled Care to the center of the demonstration arena, acutely aware of the packed audience. Hundreds of students, parents, judges, and industry professionals. Si-hyun sat in the 3rd row with Mi-ok on his lap, the baby girl's eyes wide as she took in the spectacle around her. The lead judge, Dr. Patricia Chen from MIT, looked up from her tablet. Mr. McCauley, please describe your project and its intended application. Jake took a breath and tried to ignore the tremor in his voice. CARE stands for Compassionate Adaptive Response Engine. Most competition robots are designed to complete specific tasks efficiently: sorting, navigation, construction. But I wanted to build something that could actually help people in a way that matters every day. So CARE is designed for childcare assistance. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Several judges exchanged glances. The core innovation is what I call the empathy engine, Jake continued, warming to his subject despite his nerves. CARE uses biometric sensors to read emotional states, heart rate, body temperature, movement patterns, vocal stress levels. It processes this data through algorithms that recognize distress patterns in infants and children, then responds with appropriate interventions. Dr. Chen leaned forward. Can you demonstrate? This was the moment Jake had been preparing for. The demonstration that would either validate everything he'd built or expose him as a kid with ambitious ideas beyond his execution. He'd planned to use a sophisticated baby simulator for the demonstration, a doll that could cry and respond to stimuli, standard equipment for competition presentations. But when Jake had powered it up that morning, he'd discovered it was broken, another casualty of the sabotage attempt, likely damaged when someone had tampered with CARE's internals. That's when Jake had made a desperate decision. He'd taken apart Si-hyun's $4,000 noise-canceling headphones, salvaged the acoustic sensors and haptic feedback motors, and integrated them into CARE in a way that would let the robot respond to actual audio cues and provide real-time tactile feedback. Now, in front of hundreds of people, Jake activated a recording he'd made that morning, Mi-ok's actual crying from when she'd been fussy during breakfast. The sound filled the arena, high-pitched and distressing. CARE's sensors lit up, processing the audio. Jake watched his own code execute in real time. The empathy engine analyzing the specific frequencies, identifying the type of distress, calculating appropriate responses. The robot moved forward with its characteristic flowing motion and extended its manipulator arm, the one Jake had rebuilt from toy parts and precision servos. The arm began to execute the same rhythmic tapping pattern Jake had used on the plane, producing the tap-tap-pause-tap rhythm at exactly 60 beats per minute. Simultaneously, CARE activated the salvaged haptic motors Jake had integrated, producing a gentle vibration at the frequency that promoted calm. The same low hum Jake had used with his own voice. The recording of Mi-ok's crying began to quiet almost immediately, then faded to silence. The silence in the convention center felt different than the silence on the plane. That had been the shocked quiet of disbelief. This was the hushed stillness of recognition, the moment when everyone in the room simultaneously understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Dr. Chen stood up from the judges' table, something Jake had not seen her do for any other presentation. She walked closer to CARE, studying the robot with an intensity that made Jake's heart pound. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that this robot can identify specific types of infant distress from audio cues alone and respond with scientifically validated calming techniques?" "Yes, ma'am." Jake's voice was steadier now. The empathy engine analyzes vocal stress patterns, pitch variations, and rhythm to determine whether the distress is from hunger, pain, overstimulation, or need for comfort. Then it responds with appropriate interventions, rhythmic tapping that matches resting heart rate, vibrational frequencies that promote parasympathetic nervous system activation, and adaptive pressure that mimics human soothing techniques. Another judge, a senior engineer from Boston Dynamics, leaned forward. "And you built this from salvaged components?" "Yes, sir. The core processor is from a recycled smartphone. The sensors are from various electronics I found or bought used. The haptic motors are from a broken massage device." And Jake paused, glancing at Si-hyun in the audience. "From a pair of noise-canceling headphones I modified this morning." "This morning?" Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. "You integrated new components this morning and they're functioning at this level?" "I had good motivation, ma'am." Jake thought about the sabotage, about Si-hyun on the floor in his expensive suit helping him rewire connections, about 247 people who'd believed in him. "And I learned from experience. My baby sister had colic. My grandmother taught me techniques that actually worked. I just translated that knowledge into code." The judges conferred in hushed tones. The audience waited in suspended anticipation. Jake could see Braden several rows back, his expression no longer smug but uncertain. The Stanford team looked stunned. Even the Tokyo competitors who'd placed first in the semifinals were watching with obvious respect. Dr. Chen returned to the microphone. "Mr. Macaulay, your presentation demonstrates not just technical skill, but practical innovation rooted in real-world problem-solving. This is precisely the kind of engineering we need, technology that serves human needs, rather than just showcasing technical capability." She paused, and Jake saw something that might have been a smile. "We have no further questions, thank you." Jake wheeled Care back to his station on legs that felt disconnected from his body. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. Whatever happened next, he'd proven that a kid from his neighborhood could compete at this level, could innovate in ways that mattered, could build something meaningful from nothing but salvaged parts and determination. The final 3 presentations went by in a blur. Jake barely registered them. His mind was simultaneously racing and blank, exhausted and electric, terrified and exhilarated. Then came the announcement everyone had been waiting for. "Ladies and gentlemen, the judges have reached their decision." The competition director, a distinguished woman in her 60s who'd founded 2 successful robotics companies, took the stage. This year's World Robotics Championship featured exceptional talent from around the world. The technical sophistication, creativity, and dedication we've witnessed over these 3 days represents the future of engineering. She began with 3rd place, the Tokyo team who'd designed an earthquake rescue robot. They accepted their bronze medals with gracious bows, their creation truly impressive and worthy of recognition. 2nd place went to Exeter Academy. Braden walked to the stage with his team, and Jake saw the forced smile on his face, the way his jaw was clenched. 2nd place meant a partial scholarship, recognition, prestige. But it wasn't the first. It wasn't the full ride to MIT that Braden's family had probably expected as their due. And now, 1st place. The director paused, letting the tension build. The judges were unanimous in their decision. This year's gold medal and full scholarship to Caltech goes to competitor 47 Jake Macaulay of Southside Robotics for Care, Compassionate Adaptive Response Engine. The convention center erupted. Jake stood frozen for a moment, unable to process the words he'd just heard. 1st place, gold medal, full scholarship, 4 years at Caltech, all expenses paid. His future suddenly transformed from impossible dream to concrete reality. Si-hyun was on his feet, Mi-ok in his arms, both of them applauding. Dr. Chen was smiling broadly. Even the other competitors were clapping, most of them genuine in their recognition of what Jake had accomplished. Jake walked to the stage feeling like he was moving through water. The director placed the gold medal around his neck, heavy, real, undeniable proof that this wasn't a dream. She handed him an oversized check representing the scholarship, $320,000 over 4 years, covering tuition, housing, books, living expenses, everything. "Mr. Macaulay, the director said, pulling him aside as photographers captured the moment. I've been running this competition for 12 years. I've seen brilliant projects from well-funded teams with every advantage. But what you've done building competition-winning robotics from recycled components while solving a real problem that affects millions of families, that's the kind of innovation that changes the world. Caltech is lucky to have you. The reception afterward was overwhelming. Industry representatives handed Jake business cards, talking about internships and future opportunities. Dr. Chen spent 20 minutes discussing his empathy engine algorithms and suggesting research directions he might explore in college. Other competitors, even some from teams he'd beaten, came over to congratulate him and ask about his techniques. But Jake kept looking toward the exit, where Sihyun waited with Mio-K, giving Jake space to experience his moment, but staying close enough to be there when he needed them. Finally, Jake extracted himself from the crowd and made his way over. "Congratulations, champion," Sihyun said, and the genuine pride in his voice made Jake's throat tighten. "Though I can't say I'm surprised. I knew you were extraordinary from the moment you calmed Mio-K on that plane." "I destroyed your $1,500 headphones," Jake said, the reality of what he'd done suddenly hitting him. Sihyun laughed. "Jake, you won a world championship using parts from my headphones. That's the best $1,500 I've ever spent. Consider it an investment." Mio-K reached out toward Jake, making her happy babbling sounds, and Jake took her from Sihyun's arms. The baby girl grabbed his medal and tried to put it in her mouth, completely unconcerned that she was holding proof of a world championship. "Speaking of investments," Sihyun said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "I'd like to discuss your future, Jake. Can we talk somewhere quieter?" They found a conference room away from the celebration chaos. Sihyun closed the door while Jake held Mio-K, who was contentedly playing with the metal ribbon. "You have a full scholarship to Caltech," Sihyun began. "That's extraordinary and well-deserved. But scholarships cover tuition and housing. They don't cover the countless other expenses that come with attending an elite university, and they don't provide for your family while you're studying instead of working." Jake started to protest, but Sihyun held up his hand. "I've set up an educational trust in your name. It will provide a living stipend throughout your 4 years at Caltech, enough that you won't need to work unless you choose to, enough that you can send money home to help your family. Additionally, I'm offering you a position as a junior consultant with Nexus Core Technologies. You'll work remotely during the school year, in person during summers, developing practical applications for your empathy engine technology. The salary is $60,000 annually, increasing each year." Jake couldn't breathe. $60,000 a year. That was more than his mother made. That was enough to move his family out of their cramped apartment, to get his grandmother proper medical care, to send his siblings to better schools. "But there's one more thing," Sihyun continued. "When you graduate from Caltech, if you're interested, I'd like to partner with you to start a company focused on developing accessible, empathy-based robotics technology. I'll provide the funding and business infrastructure. You provide innovation and vision. We split equity 50-50. 50-50. Jake's voice cracked. "Sir, you'd be providing all the capital, and you'd be providing the ideas that will make it successful. I've built one $12 billion company, Jake. I know how to recognize transformational technology when I see it. Your empathy engine isn't just a clever competition project. It's a fundamental shift in how we think about human-machine interaction. That's worth an equal partnership." Jake looked down at Mio-K, at this baby girl who'd inadvertently changed the entire trajectory of his life by crying on an airplane. She looked back at him with those dark, trusting eyes and smiled, showing her 2 tiny teeth. "I need to call my mom," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course. Use the room as long as you need." Sihyun took Mio-K back and headed for the door, then paused. "Jake, your grandmother's wedding ring, the one she sold to help fund your trip. I'd like to buy her a replacement, something beautiful, something worthy of the sacrifice she made. Will you let me do that?" Jake couldn't speak. He could only nod, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. When the door closed and he was alone, Jake pulled out his phone and dialed his mother's number with shaking hands. She answered on the first ring. She'd probably been waiting by the phone all day. "Baby, How did it go? Mom, Jake said, and his voice broke completely. Mom, I won. I won the whole thing. His mother's scream of joy was so loud Jake had to pull the phone away from his ear. He could hear his grandmother in the background, shouting, "Thank you, Jesus," and his siblings asking what was happening. There's more, Mom. So much more. I got the scholarship full ride to Caltech, everything paid for. And Si-hyun, the man I told you about, he set up a trust fund for my expenses and offered me a job and a future partnership. And Jake was crying and laughing simultaneously, words tumbling out. Mom, we're going to be okay. Better than okay. I'm going to be able to help. You won't have to work double shifts anymore. We can get Grandma's ring back. We can... Baby, his mother interrupted, her own voice thick with tears. I always knew you were going to do something amazing. I always knew. 247 people believed in me, Mom. They invested in me. I'm going to make sure every single one of them knows it wasn't wasted. They already know, baby. You already did.